A brave and committed young woman exposes an untouchable pedophile and satanic network operating in Australia, involving high government officials, leading politicians, television executives, top TV presenters, and the police. The lady at the center of this story is Dr. Reina Michaelson. The following is a summary of events that detail the infiltration of a high-profile, powerful group of child sex offenders into my child abuse prevention organization. What was uncovered as a result of this infiltration was the existence of an Illuminati-based child pornography and pedophile ring that is operating in Australia under the protection of senior-ranking members of Victoria Police. The members of the network include senior management and executives from a major television network, media celebrities, high-ranking politicians, police officers in charge of pedophile and child pornography investigations, senior management representatives from the Department of Education, directors of child-focused service clubs, wealthy businessmen, and others. I have tried to keep the account as brief as possible while trying to include all relevant information. The description covers events from 1995 until present. Names have been changed. Department of Education protects pedophile teacher. In 1995, I started running Australia's first child sex abuse prevention program in schools. This school-based program teaches children how to protect themselves from sexual abuse and what to do if someone tries to sexually abuse them. The program also teaches adults how they can best protect children under their care from sexual abuse. My assistant and I were at a particular high school in the northern region working with Year 9 boys. We received a note written anonymously by one of the boys asking, "What do you do if you get raped by a teacher and no one will believe you? What happens if you get raped and you enjoy it?" Later during that day, we were asked exactly the same question by a boy who was flushed red with embarrassment. I replied, "Talk to the student welfare coordinator," to which he replied, "What if he's the one who won't believe you?" I emphasized that it is important to keep telling until someone believes you. During the day, my assistant and I noticed the strange behavior of a particular teacher called Dick Newman. Later that afternoon, I learned that the car I had been driving had been rammed in the school's car park. Witnesses reported that the car had been rammed deliberately by the man who then drove off very quickly. The local police were called and ran a license check on the car, and it was discovered that the number plate was fake. Then they took photos of the crime scene using the school's camera. Later, when it was revealed that a teacher was under suspicion of sexually abusing the children at the school and then organizing the ramming of my car to intimidate me, the photos went missing and no further action was taken. Dick Newman was the only person at the school who knew my car, as he had taken it upon himself to show me to my car to give me directions to the shops during a break in classes. It was organized that the boys in Year 9 would be interviewed in order to find the victims and give them appropriate support. 3 people, including myself, my assistant, and a counselor from a sexual assault center, were responsible for conducting the interviews. At the completion of the interviews, there were concerns for approximately 12 of the boys. These concerns related specifically to sexual assault by a teacher at the school. However, by this stage, over a week had passed since the initial program, it was clear that the boys had been threatened. For example, when I interviewed the boy who had asked the questions about sexual abuse by a teacher and not being believed, he huddled into a fetal position, started crying, and said that he could not tell me what happened. When I asked him why he couldn't tell me, he replied that he had been threatened with his life. His best friend told me he would never tell what had happened. Sometime after this, we organized a theater company performance for the students on the topic of sexual abuse. While the children were seated and waiting for the play to begin, Dick Newman made an unscheduled visit to the hall. He proceeded to stand in front of each of the boys we had identified as potential victims and stare them down. The boys, who had been happy and laughing in the excitement of waiting for the play to begin, went gray with fear. Finally, I stood in front of Dick Newman so that he could not intimidate the boys any further. I was then told no further action would be taken as the boys had not named the offender. Program infiltrated by Pedophile Board of Management. I was the recipient of a very prestigious National Award for Community Service. One of the judges was a well-connected government official, Ron Snide, and another was the general manager, Bob Sisterly, of one of the major Australian television networks, Network X. After winning the award, Bob Sisterly approached me and said that he had never heard of this terrible crime, child sexual abuse, before meeting me. He said he wanted to help me get my program into every school in Victoria within 5 years and said he had the money and the connections to do this. He said he would raise $500,000 in 6 weeks and have it matched within 6 months. He said that he and Ron Snide would set my program up as an independent organization and that they would establish a board of management consisting of all of their powerful and influential friends. Ron Snide would become president of the organization and Bob Sisterly, the vice president. I agreed to Bob Sisterly's proposal as it sounded as if he would enable the program to receive substantial funding and therefore be able to reach many more children within Victoria and across Australia. I did not consider for a second that Bob Sisterly and Ron Snide could have been deceiving me in order to get control of and ultimately to destroy the child sexual abuse prevention program that I had developed. The board members and supporters that they brought to the organization were very powerful and from the highest echelons of society. These included the editor-in-chief of a major Australian newspaper, the former head of a child-focused service club, the head of the largest agricultural society in Victoria, the partner from a well-known law firm, an extremely wealthy businessman, and former Network X board member, the head of a well-known accounting firm, the head of a successful advertising company, and others. Despite having such wealth and powerful connections, in the 2-year period that they served on the board, they organized only one donation of $25,000. The board members subsequently despised the donor and ostracized him from their community, which at the time I thought was incredibly ungrateful. This is compared with over $200,000 my family and I raised doing the fundraising ourselves in the same time period. Furthermore, my efforts to secure funding were being actively sabotaged. For example, after an interview on the Channel 9 Today show, not Network X, I was contacted by a well-known multinational company who said that they would like to fund my program. This well-known company was located in Sydney, and as Bob Sisterly frequently went to Sydney, I asked if he would have a meeting with them on behalf of our organization. He agreed. However, when he returned from the meeting, he said for me not to have much hope and to not contact them for 6 months while they sorted out a new tax issue. I found this very odd, as they had been so keen to fund the organization when I had spoken to them. I phoned the woman whom I had spoken to, and she confirmed my suspicions. She had been at the meeting, and Bob Sisterly had told the company not to bother funding us, as, quote, the organization won't be around in 6 months, quote. Needless to say, we did not receive the funding. During this time period, I was without any income for 4 months. Many other people would have quit and sought other employment. However, I believed passionately in my cause and did not give up, much to the chagrin of Bob Sisterly. On one occasion, he said to me, "You've given so much to this cause in your life. Why don't you just give up? You have achieved more good in your short life than many do in a long lifetime. Why don't you just retire down in the country?" I was 28 years old. "Go on, just give up." When I replied that I would never give up, he stormed away. I was confused by this behavior, but as I trusted him, I did not think too much more about it at the time. The board members achieved one other in-kind donation. It was the use of a Honda CR-V vehicle. I appreciated the use of the vehicle while I had it, approximately 18 months. However, I later discovered that the head of the company that donated it, a close friend of Ron Snide, had just been convicted of child sex offenses. These offenses included the production of child pornography. Ron Snide organized a meeting with Tom Fatsky, the CEO of a major charitable trust and personal friend of his, and to other members of the board. At that meeting, I was amazed when Tom asked me, "Do you ever think that by preventing children from having sexual relationships with adults that you are actually harming them?" I replied by citing the research that strongly indicates that adult-child sexual relationships are harmful to children, but he had switched his mind off to my argument. He then stated that in 100 years or so, it will be revealed that such relationships are not harmful, but that what I was doing was harmful to children. I was certainly taken aback, and Ron said, "Don't worry, Tom just thinks on a very high intellectual plane. High above yours." Needless to say, we didn't get funding from Ron Snide's very good friend after all. Meeting with a very powerful pedophile politician. After winning the award, I had a meeting with a very powerful state politician, Greg Neckett. At that time, Greg Neckett was the most powerful person in the state. As well as being politically powerful, he also had key business interests, including in the media. When I was first introduced to him, he was staring at me quite sleazily. After he asked what work I do, and my response was child abuse prevention, he would not make eye contact at all and sought to exclude me from the meeting in a very bullying manner. It was well known that Greg Neckett was a serious domestic violence offender and that his wife was frequently being admitted to shelters in secret. However, given the power and status of Mr. Neckett, the issue was never raised in the mainstream media. I was later to be informed by a very reliable and trusted source from the child welfare field that there was a file containing serious child sex offenses against boys by Greg Neckett, but because of his enormous power in Victoria, the police would not act on it. I also discovered from a former sex worker that Greg Neckett frequently paid St. Kilda boy sex workers for sex, and that one of these boys, quote, talked too much to the wrong people and ended up dead with an accidental heroin overdose, quote. It was also alleged that Greg Neckett intentionally abused the boys in unusual situations, for example, in a helicopter, so that if it ever got out, the boys' testimonies would seem unbelievable. This, of course, is exactly the same strategy used by offenders in the U.S. Child Care Center cases. Interestingly, Greg Neckett has recently commissioned a statue of himself as a gargoyle. Later, I met with another politician from the same political party who told me that Greg Neckett is really into that, child sex abuse. The same politician told me that in the late 80s and early 90s, the police were getting too close to the truth, too close to people in high positions of power who were also pedophiles, and so the unit that had been established to investigate organized pedophilia was shut down. Soon after, a pedophile police officer was put in charge of investigating these offenses to ensure that the truth never got out and that this high-ranking network of offenders would never get caught. Network X produces pornography. One day, I was working on a computer at Network X. As I was working, Bob Sisterly approached my computer and put a floppy disk in the machine. He said, "Look at this," and then proceeded to bring up images of pornography involving humans and Sesame Street characters. I was very embarrassed and did not know how to react. I asked, "Where did you get that?" And he replied, "Oh, someone put it together here," indicating that Network X was producing the pornography. I was later to discover that Network X is also producing child pornography and is, in fact, an Illuminati-owned and run television station. I was also later to discover that Bob Sisterly is a passionate member of the Illuminati religion. Bob Sisterly introduces me to Mr. Television. After winning the above-mentioned award, I was invited to go on one of the morning television shows on Network X. This was before my association with Bob Sisterly. Ironically, after my association with Bob Sisterly, Network X did not do any promotion of my work at all. It is hosted by one of the most famous and longest-serving television personalities in Australia, Ernie Old. I was asked to prepare a number of questions that Ernie would ask me. I prepared very straightforward questions that focused on the work, so I was quite shocked when he glared at me and said, "Are you doing this because it happened to you?" I was also stunned when he refused to allow the phone number of my organization to be presented on the air for donations. When I later became closely associated with Network X, Bob Sisterly would often say to me, "You know, Ernie Old really likes you. He really likes you." This surprised me because my experience of Ernie Old had been the exact opposite of that. Interestingly, Bob Sisterly also frequently said to me, "Greg Neckett, the very powerful politician, really likes me since I started helping you. He has me sit next to him at all of the formal functions we attend now." This was indeed true. Greg Neckett, Bob Sisterly, and Ron Snide were all the best of friends. After my experience with Network X, I subsequently discovered that in the late 1980s, Ernie Old was frozen out of the television industry due to allegations of his involvement in the production of child pornography. Although his alleged involvement in this activity was well publicized at the time, he was never charged, and about a year later he joined Network X. Since then, he has continued to play a significant role in the production of child pornography in Australia. One contact who works on the set of the morning program hosted by Ernie Old finds the work to be very distressing, as other on-air talent are very open about their pedophilia. This contact is disgusted, as his sister is a victim of child sex offenses. However, he does not want to publicly disclose the information as he will lose his job. In addition to the above, I am now in contact with a boy who was paid $2,000 a night to have sex with Ernie Old, from the ages of 15 to 18 years. Introduction to Pedophile Police. There is a specialized police unit in Victoria that, since the early 1990s, is responsible for investigating all child sex offenses involving multiple victims, offenses committed by teachers, as well as child pornography offenses. I had a meeting with the head of this unit, Detective Senior Sergeant Nick Flanagan, and was very surprised when the first thing he said to me was, "Does Greg Nickett know about your program? Greg Nickett should know about your program." I found this a very odd thing for him to say as an opening statement, and especially so given the information known about Greg Nickett's alleged sexual abuse of boys. I thought it impossible for this police officer not to know of these things, given his specialist role. Relationship between Nick Flanagan and Bob Sisterly. I subsequently became aware of the unusual relationship between Nick Flanagan, police, and Bob Sisterly, Network X, TV. I invited Nick Flanagan to do a presentation for the board members. Ron Snide was so impressed by Nick Flanagan that he wanted to invite him onto the board of management, along with the other pedophile members. I later discovered that Nick Flanagan and Bob Sisterly, although pretending not to know each other at the board meeting, had a very cozy relationship indeed. Specifically, a couple of years ago, a senior staff member at Network X was charged with procuring children for prostitution. At the time, the wife of a detective working in Nick Flanagan's unit, Jan Pummel, received a very sudden and significant promotion to become Bob Sisterly's personal assistant. It was a clear conflict of interest and deeply compromising to the investigation. Jan Pummel's husband should not have been involved in investigating Network X staff for their involvement in procuring children for prostitution or any other child sex offenses connected to Network X. However, with the appointment of the detective's wife to personal assistant of the general manager of Network X, it was guaranteed that no other information pertaining to Network X's illegal activities involving sex offenses against children would be pursued by Nick Flanagan or his unit. And Jan Pummel enjoyed her unexpected and incredibly well-paid new position at Network X. Pedophile police called in to investigate pedophile teacher and other offenses. In 1999, fresh allegations were made against pedophile teacher Dick Newman. This time, teenage girls reported that Dick Newman approaches students and asks them to meet him after school to meet Winston the baseball bat. They indicated that Winston was Dick Newman's penis. They reported that other students were very affected by this behavior, and some had taken to writing warnings to each other on the desks, such as, quote, "If Newman asks you to meet Winston, don't do it. It's his dick," close quote. At last, Newman had been named and the victims were prepared to come forward. Newman admitted to these offenses and received 5 sessions of counseling. I then discovered that Newman had conveniently taken up the temporary position in a country school, like a priest being moved from parish to parish when things get too hot. The principal at the original school had not told the new school the circumstances surrounding his transfer and had instead said, "Poor Dick, he's had a difficult time lately." I later discovered that this principal was an expert liar and had gone over and above the call of duty in protecting this pedophile teacher. At this new country school, it was not long before the further allegations of child abuse by Newman came out. Incidents of verbal abuse, such as calling students fucking stupid, were revealed, as well as physical assaults, such as dragging the students out of the classroom and throwing them on the floor. In another physical assault, Newman grabbed the 12-year-old boy by the neck and held him by his neck against a wall. Newman admitted to the latter assault, wrote a letter of apology, and provided financial compensation for the loss of the necklace. With Newman being named and various offenses being admitted to, I reported his behavior for criminal investigation to Nick Flanagan's unit. It also provided the opportunity for the 1995 offenses to be reinvestigated. However, Nick Flanagan interviewed only 2 of the 12 boys on the list from 1995, and reported to me that as the first 2 boys did not disclose anything, the others would not be interviewed. In relation to the offenses against the teenage girls, Flanagan said that, at 15 years of age, the girls were too young and he did not want to distress the girls' families by bringing up the topic of child sexual abuse. Therefore, these offenses by Newman would not be investigated either. I could not believe what I was hearing. Child sex offenses are offenses because they happened against children. And at 15, the victims were hardly at the young end of the age spectrum. It was a completely nonsensical reason for not investigating Dick Newman. As for the physical assaults, Flanagan said that he was not responsible for such investigations, so those cases would not be pursued either. Interestingly, Bob Sisterly also frequently said to me, "Greg Neckett, very powerful politician, really likes me since I started helping you. He has me sit next to him at all of the formal functions we attend now. He said, 'You do understand, don't you?' It was not a question, and I replied that I did not." However, Nick Flanagan was not prepared to discuss the situation amicably, and Dick Newman evaded investigation by both the police and the unit established to investigate such offenses, and by the Department of Education. Further dealings with the pedophile police. Whilst at the country school, Goldtown, disclosures of child sexual abuse by other offenders were made by many children. The disclosures centered on 2 offenders in the town. The specialized unit arrived to investigate. However, the main victim of sexual abuse, Sammy, a 12-year-old girl, did not attend school that day. She arrived after school on her bike and her face was visibly disfigured. I was told by her best friend that she had been bashed, but her friend would not tell me who did this to Sammy. Her smashed-in face was warning enough for all of the children. The police later went to her house where she fainted upon seeing them. She did not disclose any abuse at all. Despite the fact that her face was visibly disfigured and swollen from a recent assault, the police did not pursue the matter further. The specialized police unit totally destroyed any chance of the truth being revealed and the victims receiving the justice they deserved. For example, they left children waiting all day to be interviewed and did not end up interviewing them, including witnesses to attempted child rapes. They interviewed one 12-year-old victim, Lucy, and totally intimidated her. When the girl indicated that the police didn't believe her the first time, she told them what had happened to her. When she indicated the police didn't believe her the first time she told them what happened to her, one officer leaned right over the top of her, pointing his finger directly in her face and hissed, "Don't say that! You don't know that!" I was shaking and I was an adult sitting next to the girl. As she walked out of the interview room, the officer said in a voice loud enough for the girl to hear, "We have serious concerns about the truth of what this girl is saying." It had the desired effect. Lucy burst into tears and said, "The police don't believe me. I don't want to keep going." The welfare coordinator, who was also in the room during the interview and who was also an experienced sexual assault counselor and child protection officer, said to me, "That wasn't an interview. That was designed to stop a child from talking." The police did not pursue the case any further on the following grounds. No one would believe Sammy if she disclosed the abuse in the future, as she hadn't disclosed the first time. The fact that she had been bashed would not be seen as relevant to her hesitancy to disclose. Lucy had led all the children on to make up stories of sexual abuse for fun, even though the children were visibly traumatized. In relation to the sexual abuse of a boy, quote, "Men try to touch other men's penises after football matches all the time," quote, so it was not worthy of pursuing. And finally, that there was not enough evidence. This is despite the fact that there were witnesses to the attempted rapes of the children, and the testimonies of many victims provided significant corroboration. Also, many adults reported having been sexually abused by the same offenders when they were children, but the police refused to interview these adults. The case is stonewalled by the pedophile police. The police recommended that the welfare coordinator make reports to the Child Protection Department, as they stated that it was a protective issue, not a criminal one. The welfare coordinator did this, but weeks passed and the children were not interviewed, and she inquired as to why. She was informed that the Child Protection Department would not be taking any further action on the advice of the police. So, after telling the welfare coordinator to take the case to the Child Protection for investigation, the police effectively stonewalled the investigation by advising Child Protection not to investigate. Relationship between Bob Sisterly and Nick Flanagan. During the 2-year association I had with Bob Sisterly, Ron Snide and the board of management that they had established, I trusted them implicitly. Although incidents occurred that often left me confused and often baffled, and of course frequently without funding, I continued to trust them. Snide always said to me, "I'm here to help." It was his favorite saying. I therefore reported all of the events that had occurred at the Northern Secondary School and the Goldtown School to Bob Sisterly. Bob Sisterly then told me that he knows a Detective Senior Sergeant Nick Flanagan, in contrast to his earlier pretense of not knowing him at all. He stated that Nick Flanagan is a really good bloke. However, when I spelt out the stonewalling of the Goldtown case, Bob Sisterly's face twitched and he became visibly uncomfortable. I had never seen Bob Sisterly react in this way. It was soon after this that very strange events began to occur. On one occasion, Bob Sisterly was on the phone to his boss of Network X. When his boss realized that I was present, he began to speak aggressively, not knowing that I could hear him. He was saying, "Put her on the phone with me. I'll sort her out." Of course, I found this all to be very strange, as I had never even met this man before. However, when Bob Sisterly apologized on behalf of his boss, I accepted it and put it out of my mind. Again, because at that time I trusted him. I had recently purchased a very cheap country property that I planned to use as a retreat for abused children. I invited the board members to view the site. None attended. However, Bob Sisterly said that he wanted to go, alone with me. He said that he had set aside the whole day for it and was putting me under enormous pressure to go with him. I felt very uncomfortable about it as he had insisted on a number of details. First, it had to be a complete secret. I wasn't even allowed to tell my parents that I was going, let alone where I was going. Second, he had to drive. I wasn't even allowed to drive my car to the station, and for us to drive together from there, my car had to stay at my unit car park. And third, Bob Sisterly insisted on picking me up from my unit before daybreak. This was unnecessary as the trip only takes 2 hours. Of course, all these bizarre conditions and the huge pressure that Bob Sisterly was putting me under made me feel extremely wary. With my parents' help, I made up an excuse at the very last minute and did not go. However, if I had done as Bob Sisterly had wanted, and if anything bad happened to me that day, I would have gone missing without a trace. Sammy's relationship to Network X. Sammy, the 12-year-old girl from Goldtown, was the main victim of the sexual abuse being perpetrated against children in her town. She referred to the offender, a man in his 60s, as her boyfriend, and her close friends knew of the sexual activities between her and the man. The offender also happened to be the best friend of her father. I was asked to provide support to Sammy, and in one session it became apparent that Sammy's personality had been totally fragmented. In her words, she was like a house with mirrors everywhere, smashed into broken bits. It was later that I learned about the Illuminati use of trauma-based mind control, sexual abuse, and satanic ritual to force children to create altered personalities. Other information from Sammy has led me to believe that she has been subjected to all these forms of abuse. Sammy also told me that her relative takes her to Queensland, Australia, whenever I want, and that she can get whatever I want too. It was only later that I learned of the immense significance of what Sammy was telling me. Sammy's relative is a board member of Network X who is based in Queensland. It is my belief that Sammy was being used in Network X's production of child pornography, both in Victoria and Queensland. However, here is another example of the police's failure to investigate a case with ominous connections to Network X. In particular, the police unit that had been established specifically and exclusively to investigate such cases well and to truly ensure that this case would go nowhere. After 2 sessions with Sammy, I was told that the school had received complaints that I had brainwashed the children and the support sessions were terminated. More connections to the Illuminati, the satanic cult in Goldtown. I was to learn later that there was a satanic cult operating in Goldtown. I learned this from 2 independent sources. One was from a Christian woman who was raised in the town and who since has moved elsewhere. The other was from an adult survivor of the cult, Mick. The satanic cult is very powerful within the town and was headed up by the most powerful and influential families of the town. One of the members owned and operated the photographic studio in the town. Furthermore, Greg Neckett, the powerful politician mentioned previously, has significant business operations extremely close to Goldtown, and he was driven by his driver to this location every week. Mick's experiences. Mick was introduced to the satanic cult as a very young child by an extended relative. Mick informed me of many experiences he was subjected to as a child in this cult. From everything that I have been told by Mick, the cult appears to be the Order Templi Orientis, Illuminati, or operating in Australia. Mick now suffers from multiple personality disorder and dissociative identity disorder, but has survived his experiences remarkably well considering the traumas he has been through. As a child, Mick was forced to attend blood rituals, where animals and small children were sacrificed and their blood and organs consumed. Mick was required to clean up the blood after these rituals. The children and babies were street children or were taken from orphanages so that they could not be traced and no one would know or care if they went missing. The rituals were spoken in Latin and were clearly satanic. The rituals took place at various locations, including Goldtown. Mick and other children would be driven to the rituals in the boots of cars. The members of the cult were extremely powerful members of society. There were numerous politicians, mainly from the Conservative Party. These people would often speak of important events before they would actually occur. Mick was also sexually abused by Gerald Onassis, the famous television personality and professional partner of Ernie Old. Mick was one of the many children who were used to host parties of the cult's members. At these parties, the children acted as waiters and were naked. Many of the adults, but not all, would wear masks at these parties. After the food was served, the adults would have sex with the children. Children who tried to escape were killed, often in front of the other children in order to control the children through fear. Once, Mick and another child had tried to escape but were caught. The other child was murdered by having her head smashed open with a rock. Her body was then dumped in a nearby mine shaft. Mick was spared the same fate as he was told that he was the chosen one, selected to carry on the traditions of the group. Mick was forced to participate in the production of child pornography, including movies as well as still photographs. This involved sexual activity with other children as well as adults. He would get paid a small amount for his sexual services, while the relative who brought him to the events would get paid a large amount of money. As he got older, Mick was no longer used for sexual purposes by the group, but was required to recruit new younger children. When he was old enough, in his 20s, Mick was able to escape the group, but they continued to contact him with threats. Bob Sisterly's religion. During my association with Bob Sisterly, I got to know him in some ways quite well. One day he informed me of his religious beliefs. These were the opposite of mine, as I am a Christian. I was also informed by one of his colleagues in the media industry that Bob's religion is weird shit. At the time, I had not heard of the Illuminati, and it is only now that I realize that Bob Sisterly is an active and dedicated member of the Australian Illuminati. The symbolism used in Network X promotional material is totally consistent with that of the Illuminati, Order Templi Orientis, such as the key colors blue and gold, and the key imagery involving flames. Telephone interference and intimidation begins. It was after reporting the events at Goldtown to Bob Sisterly that unusual events began to occur. My phone line began clicking, and the voicemail service recorded the sounds of a tape clicking over. Note, voicemail does not use tapes for recording, so the tape was from another source. 2 of my organization's staff members had their cars broken into on the same night. In one car, the book The Clocks by Agatha Christie was on the front seat. The book is the story of a series of murders where the only evidence left at each murder scene is a clock. On the front seat of the other staff member's car was a broken clock. Nothing was stolen from either car. On one occasion, I purposely said over the phone that I kept all my files in the backyard shed. This was not true. I just wanted to test the security of the telephone line. Soon after, the back shed was broken into. Board members propose a name change. At one board meeting, Harry Napkin, the head of the Agricultural Society, proposed to launch the organization, despite the fact that it had been operating for nearly 2 years. He had 3 ideas. The first was that a rodeo would be organized, and whenever a rider fell from their horse or bull, money would be donated. Thus, it would be money for every bruised butt. The second proposal was to organize a beauty pageant for 12-year-old girls. There would be an award given for the prettiest girl on the shiniest pony. A photo of her on her horse would be used as a center page spread in the leading newspaper, courtesy of the editor-in-chief contact. A third proposal was to have a photo of sexually abused children in an animal birthing center. This photo would also be published in the leading newspaper. Harry Napkin also proposed a name change. He proposed to change the name of the organization to Shine. I did not want to do this, and the members of the board put me under incredible pressure to adopt this name change. It was only later that I learned about the Illuminati connections and the significance of their symbolism and language. Shine is a very significant Illuminati term. Realization dawns. It was at this point that I realized that something was dreadfully wrong. I rejected all of the proposed ideas, very politely but firmly. I also called for all outstanding criminal records checks to be undertaken immediately. The criminal records check has been designed only to identify whether a person had committed any sexual assaults against children or had any involvement in related offenses, such as child pornography. Therefore, if a person had smoked marijuana in their university days, this would not be revealed in the criminal record check. This was a policy that I had insisted on right from the start, nearly 2 years ago. However, Bob Sisterly had given numerous excuses every time I requested his. He even went so far as to suggest that he would organize it on the sly using his contacts in the force. I did not pursue that option and instead gave the board members 2 weeks to complete their forms and submit them. Bob Sisterly, while initially embracing the policy at the start, ultimately refused to submit a criminal records check. The significance of Shine. I discovered that there is an Australian internet-based group called Shine. The site includes a membership section where members are able to exchange photos, etc., including S&M and hardcore Ernie Old style. It is a child pornography club that operates similar to the notorious Wonderland Club. I noted the code names used by the operators of the Shine site, one of which was NATAS, Satan backwards. I went to the Network X site and entered a secret section on the site which members of the public would never know about. It asked for the password, so I typed in NATAS, which took me to another level. It then asked for the next level password, which I did not have. The computer then went berserk and was almost impossible to turn off. I managed to do so only by pulling out all of the connections. Soon after this, the internet site for Network X was shut down and remained shut down for a number of months, which is rather unusual given that Network X is such a large company. Later that year, the Department of Education put on a concert involving thousands of children. They chose to call it Shine. This was an interesting choice of title given my experience and other people's experiences of the Department of Education protecting pedophile teachers. A further interesting connection was that Bob Sisterly and Ron Snide organized a meeting between us and the senior managers of the Department of Education. When we all met, the men acted as if they did not know each other and were meeting each other for the first time, exchanging business cards, etc. However, when the men thought I was gone, I was in fact standing just out of their sight, it was very clear that they not only knew each other, but that they knew each other extremely well. They were saying things such as, "Great to see you again, mate," and slapping each other on the back. Escape from Bob Sisterly and the pedophile board. After I discovered what was going on, at least I started to discover what was going on, I knew I had to break away from Bob Sisterly, Ron Snide, and the people that they had put on the board of management. The AGM was coming up and I organized for my family to attend. We did this secretly as we knew that the phone lines were being monitored. On the night of the AGM, the board members were visibly shocked when they saw that members of my family were attending. It transpired that, rather than undertake a criminal records check, the members of the board had planned to resign on the spot. This served 2 purposes. 1, they avoided having to undergo the criminal records check. 2, the organization would effectively fold as there would be no one to take up the board member positions. This is exactly what Bob Sisterly had wanted from the beginning, but especially since I had begun to uncover the corrupt pedophile police activities and the crimes in Goldtown. However, as my family had attended the meeting, they were able to take up positions on the board and the organization did not fold. On the surface, the meeting was very amicable and civilized. Bob Sisterly tried to remain calm, but he ended up storming out of the meeting half an hour early. Mother receives death threat from Bob Sisterly. My family and I all waited for a half an hour after the meeting had closed to recover before leaving. We had all come in different cars, and my mother had parked her car in a nearby car park. She walked to her car by herself. We had not yet learned to be security conscious at that stage. As she approached her car, she was surprised to see Bob Sisterly there. He had left the meeting half an hour early. He then approached her and said, "You'd better watch yourself. If you don't, someone might just run over you." He then drove off very suddenly, and another board member followed in a different car. My mother and father told me about this incident, which left my mother very shaken. Soon after, I received a message from Bob Sisterly saying, "I only want to help." I was infuriated at the evil of this man, so I phoned his office and left a message with his personal assistant, Jan Pummel. I didn't know the significance of her husband's relationship with Bob Sisterly and Network X at this time, saying, "Bob has said he just wants to help me. Could you please tell him that it would be helpful if he could undertake the criminal records check that he has avoided for so long?" After all, it is designed to only reveal if the person has committed sex offenses against children or related offenses, like the production of child pornography. Oh, could you also tell him that it would be very helpful if he did not threaten members of my family? Death threats against my family really aren't helpful. If you could pass this message on, that would be great. Thanks. Soon after leaving this message, my mother received a letter from Bob Sisterly. In the letter, he stated that he was only joking when he told her to watch out or she'd end up being run over. Yeah, real funny joke. Report to Department of Education, Complaints and Investigation Unit. After these experiences, I made a complaint to the Complaints and Investigations Unit of the Department of Education. My complaint related to the conduct of teacher Dick Newman, which amounted to repeated acts of misconduct against students, and the police investigation at Goldtown. Interestingly, the head of the Department of Education Complaints and Investigations Unit, Paul Gibbons, was at the very first meeting I had to outline my complaint. It was after this meeting that the material, which I had been assured by Peter Gibbons would remain strictly confidential, was given to Nick Flanagan and Edith Ireland, who subsequently paid a visit to the new president of the board in an effort to pressure me to drop the complaint. Paul Gibbons then left that posting, but coincidentally was brought back to it to finish off the case involving Dick Newman. Paul Gibbons wrote a letter to me exonerating Dick Newman on all counts because the witnesses, which I had provided, cannot substantiate your claims. As you know, of the 8 witnesses that I had provided to corroborate the case, only one had been contacted, and she had reconfirmed the concerns about Dick Newman. In fact, she stated that she was amazed that it had taken so long for the matter to be investigated. She was shocked to discover that Dick Newman had been exonerated and that the Department of Education had lied about her testimony. After I did the telephone round of the witnesses, I had listed and learned that only one had been contacted. I phoned Paul Gibbons to ask how many of the witnesses had in fact been contacted. He said that he didn't know, but that he would call me back within 24 hours. Needless to say, I did not receive a return phone call from pedophile protecting Paul Gibbons. I truly believe that if the parents of children attending Victorian schools knew the extent to which pedophile teachers are being protected by the Department of Education, they would boycott the education system altogether. And if they knew the suffering that some children and families have had to endure as a result of the pedophile protecting actions of the Department of Education, they would boycott the system on those grounds too. I am convinced if the parents of children attending the Northern Region Secondary College knew of the monster teaching their children and his shocking and extensive history of abusing students, there would not be a single child enrolled in that school in the future. Leaked document. After numerous meetings concerning the complaint, which I was told would be kept strictly confidential, particularly from Nick Flanagan and his unit, a document was leaked to me from within the Department of Education. The document revealed that the department plans to absolve Dick Newman from all complaints. This investigation had been totally and completely corrupted in order to absolve Newman. The grounds for this were that no complaints of a sexual nature had been made against Dick Newman since 1995. This was unbelievable. So Newman's invitations for students to meet his penis after school were not considered to be sexual. Also, it was stated that as the schools had taken action in relation to each case, there was nothing more to be done. So it was therefore acceptable for a teacher to commit repeated acts of serious misconduct against multiple students at different schools. It was very clear that this teacher was being actively protected. Theft of Department of Education files. I left a message with the Minister of Education to inform her that I had received information to indicate that the investigation had been seriously corrupted. Soon after, the unit that I lived in was broken into and files containing information about the Department of Education's protection of pedophile teachers were stolen. This included a letter from a mother pleading for help as her son had been sexually assaulted by a teacher and was now suicidal. She wanted my help as the Department of Education was covering up for this pedophile teacher. Nothing else was stolen from the unit. Visit to the new president of the board. A new president was appointed to the board along with other new members. One day, the new president of the board received a visit from one of the workers in the child protection field. This woman, Enid Ireland, approached the new president and told him that Detective Senior Sergeant Mick Flanagan knew about the complaint I had made to the Department of Education, indicating a significant breach of confidentiality. She told the new president to cease any association with me and my organization for the sake of your professional reputation. The incident spooked the new president enough for him to telephone me in an effort to get me to drop my complaint against Flanagan and his unit, which I refused to do. Thankfully, the new president had the integrity and courage to stick with our organization despite the pressure he was being put under. Anonymous reports to Crime Stoppers. Approximately 12 months had passed when I decided I would make an anonymous call to Crime Stoppers, a phone-in service where people can give anonymous tips to police about crimes. I telephoned Crime Stoppers from a public phone and informed the woman, Katie, of the pedophile network that was operating in Melbourne. She asked me to call back again with further information, and I did so. I told Katie that the network was operating under police protection and at that stage had not given her the police officers' names who were implicated. She then asked me to provide the names of the police officers who were involved. I told her that I was very nervous to do this, as my family and I had suffered very negative repercussions as a result of this group, and I did not want us to have to go through any more traumas. She spoke to her boss, and he promised me that the information I provided would not go to the police officers of concern, and that the information would go straight to the Ethical Standards Division, ESD, which is the same as Internal Investigations. As she and her boss had promised that the information would go straight to ESD, I gave her the names of the officers. When I called back again to find out how the case was proceeding, I was shocked when Katie told me that her boss had forced her to send the information to Nick Flanagan's unit. The information had gone directly to Nick Flanagan. Katie apologized and appeared to be genuinely distressed at what had happened. I asked to speak to her boss, and I told him that he had promised that the material would go to ESD. And he exclaimed, "Do you realize how serious your allegations are?" I replied that of course I did. That's why I wanted the information to go to ESD and not to the police officers of concern. He said, "We don't pass on information to ESD." Katie got back on the phone and was very clearly upset. She implored me to contact ESD and give them the information myself. Intimidation and harassment begins again. Soon after this, my family and I were subjected to harassment and surveillance. For example, nearly every day there would be a car out the front of my parents' home, where I had now moved to for safety reasons, with two men just sitting there. The men often had large walkie-talkies. The car often had large, thick aerials. Whenever a member of the family walked out of the house, the people in the cars would speed off. However, sometimes we were followed by people in the cars. The cars were usually very flashy, like large four-wheel drives or dark, shiny sedans. I was often followed by men in white, shiny cars with the number plates beginning with VHA, and was later to learn that these cars were often used as government vehicles. Sometimes I would come out of a location, say a friend's house, and there would be a man in one of those flashy vehicles just waiting there. It was very menacing and very stressful for my family and I. We also received unusual phone calls at that time, clicking noises over the phone, and sometimes the phone calls were actively intercepted with heavy breathing or laughter or shuddering screams. My incoming mail was very clearly being interfered with. Visits from the Mormons. One day, my mother and I came out from my parents' house, and there was a group of men waiting in a car out the front of our house again. They sped off when we came out, but this time I got in my car and followed them. As I drove towards them, they had turned their car around and were facing me. They flashed their lights at me. I drove around the cul-de-sac, and I was shocked when I got to my parents' house again. The men were talking to my mother from in their car. I called for her to get away from the men, and she replied, "It's okay, dear, they're Mormons." I do not believe they were Mormons, and I held my hand on the car horn and chased them out of the street. A license check on their car, however, seemed to indicate that they really were Mormons or were using a Mormon-registered car. I do not think that they would ever return, especially if they really were Mormons. However, 2 weeks later, I was getting into my car and saying goodbye to my mother. The same men approached my mother, not realizing that I was in the car. They asked if they could ask her a few questions about me. I then stuck my head out of the car window and said, "If you've got any questions, you can ask me." They were very surprised that I was there and asked, "Why did you chase us out of the street that day? We're just Mormons." I replied, "Because some of your behavior is most un-Mormon-like." The man then said, "Like what?" And I replied, "Like flashing your lights at me." He then said, "Oh, you mean when we were taking photos of you? You didn't like us taking photos of you?" The Mormons had just admitted to taking photos of me without my knowledge or consent. I told them to stay away from me and my family. Soon after this, I saw the same men in a different car. It was a dark, flashy sedan, similar to those that were often sitting in our street. I got the license plate of this car and gave it to a trusted police officer. He told me that the car was owned by a debt-collecting agency, or more likely a surveillance company, as they often used debt collecting as a front. The owner of the car, however, not one of the men who had been seen in the car, was a Mormon. The Mormons were very clearly conducting surveillance on my family and me. Reports to Deputy Ombudsman. After their problems with Crime Stoppers, I decided to call the Ombudsman's office and pass on the information I had to them, including the incident with Crime Stoppers. The Deputy Ombudsman, Ian Softman, put me under a great deal of pressure to meet with him and hand over all of my information to him for investigation. I said that I wanted to meet with the new Chief Commissioner of Police, Angela Franklin, as she was dedicated to flushing out bent police. Ian Softman told me that he would try to arrange this. However, he reported that it was not possible and again put me under great pressure to give all of my information to him for investigation. I finally did succeed in getting an appointment with the Chief Commissioner. Contrary to Ian Softman's claim that she could not meet with me, she had never been informed that I had tried to get a meeting with her through him. She was extremely annoyed when she had been left out of the loop in this way, and the incident just added to my suspicions about the motives of Softman. Thefts of evidence. While I was reporting information to Softman over the phone anonymously, 2 thefts of evidence occurred. On the first occasion, the file was stolen from the boot of my car. I left it there for 2 hours while I attended to a matter at the school. When I returned, I discovered that it had been taken. I rushed home to check that the copy left at my parents' house was still there. I discovered that my parents' house had been broken into, the dogs drugged, and the file stolen from a hiding place. Much was taken, including the letter of admission from Bob Sisterly of the threat to my mother. Luckily, I had kept a 3rd copy with someone else. Fires at Network X Studio, Melbourne GPO, and Celebrity's Home. At this time, a number of significant fires occurred. One was at a studio used by Network X. Interestingly, the copy of the network's recent multi-million-dollar production had coincidentally been removed from the studio 2 days before the fire. All that survived the fire was a Sesame Street character, which took center place in a photo of the scene in the leading newspaper's report. Within a week, there was another fire, this time at the Melbourne General Post Office. All of the post office's boxes and their contents were destroyed, though little else was affected. Finally, again within a week, a suspicious house fire occurred in the home of a well-known television celebrity. This celebrity is a member of the same secret society as Ron Snide. All that was destroyed in the fire was a collection of videos and photographs. Interestingly, the comment of the celebrity was, "It can all be put to bed now." A strange thing to say after your house has just gone up in smoke. A further interesting incident occurred at Melbourne's largest brothel. An armed intruder stole a relatively small amount of cash from the brothel, but was led to the safe where videotapes of clients engaging in sexual activities were kept. Videotapes of clients were stolen, including those of Greg Neckett, a frequent client of the establishment. A reliable contact informed me that the theft was actually an inside job. Within a 2-week period, thousands of videos had gone up in smoke or been destroyed. These events occurred at the time of the reports being made to Ian Softman. It is also very interesting to note that at that time, the British section of Interpol was in Victoria conducting a secret investigation into child pornography. Children tortured or died in mysterious circumstances. It was also around this time that a number of children connected to the child pornography industry were either killed in suspicious circumstances or tortured. I was working with a young girl and was very concerned for her safety at this time. I told a trusted police officer of my concerns for this girl. A week later, she had been rushed to the hospital. An unregistered tank, her word meaning a very solidly built car, had come out of nowhere and slammed into the car in which she was a passenger. Thankfully, she survived. Fears for my life. I had managed to arrange a meeting with the Chief Commissioner of Police. This was no small feat, as there had been many stumbling blocks, and it appeared that there were people actively trying to prevent such a meeting. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, I was in real fear for my life. On one occasion, I came home late at night and saw 2 men sitting in a car just up from my parents' house. As no one was home at my parents' house, I drove to the top of the hill to stay with my friends. They did not hear the doorbell, and while I was standing in the street wondering where I would go, the men in the car drove up the hill very slowly, looking for me. I had all of the evidence with me. Since the thefts, I did not let it out of my sight, and I had to quickly hide in the bushes. The men drove up and down the street no less than 5 times looking for me. I had to cut through the backs of homes in order to get to another friend's house where I stayed the night. They also witnessed the men driving up and down the street looking for me. The next evening, I heard and saw the same car drive up the hill. As no one was going to be home that evening, I quickly got in my car and drove to another friend's house where I stayed the night. The next morning, the friends discovered that their front light had been smashed in. No other houses on the street had been affected. However, the neighbors did report hearing strange cars driving up and down the quiet street late that night. It was after this that I wondered if I would live to be able to hand over all the information I had to the Chief Commissioner. Meeting with the Chief Commissioner of Police. I attended the meeting with the Chief Commissioner of Police along with the trusted police officer who had investigated the house break-in and thefts of the files. The Chief Commissioner believed me and was very concerned. She organized for the matter to be thoroughly investigated. The Chief Commissioner asked me if I wanted police protection for my family, which I declined. Sometimes that results in more trouble. She told me I could contact her office whenever necessary. Soon after this, my unit was broken into and one of my collectible dolls had the eyes painted over. I phoned the Chief Commissioner's personal assistant and let her know that I would be sending the Chief a letter via registered mail. At the start of the conversation, the line was clearly intercepted, which the personal assistant heard. She told me to call her back from a public phone. Interestingly, after letting her know that a letter was coming to her via registered mail, the Chief Commissioner did not receive it. I called some weeks later after having received no response and was told that the letter had somehow been intercepted. All letters to the chief are signed for, and the person who had signed for the registered letter I had sent was not known in the police force. However, after 2 days of the Chief Commissioner demanding to know where the letter went, it turned up with a post-it note attached. "Sorry, didn't know where to send this." Well, to the person it is addressed to might be a start. Ethical Standards Department investigation gets off to a questionable start. I had a meeting to begin my statement to the Ethical Standards Department. It was clear that the officer appointed to the case did not believe what I had to report. While he went to have a smoke, he accidentally left me with the report that had been written by another police officer in response to my own report that had been submitted to the chief. I could see why the police officer I was dealing with was so dismissive of what I had to say. The report discredited everything that I had reported. It made a mockery of my claim that Ernie Old and other high-profile individuals were involved in pedophilia and stated that there was nothing to support my claims of intimidation or harassment. This was despite the fact that there were numerous witnesses to these events. The author went on to say that an investigation must be seen to be conducted, however, because if the information was to be made public, there would be a public outcry. That is, make it look like it is being investigated, but don't do anything. Even more disturbing was the specific recommendation that a detective, Alex Mock, be appointed to conduct the investigation. Detective Mock was a close friend and colleague of Nick Flanagan's and had in fact worked with him in his unit for many years. Indeed, Detective Mock had only left Nick Flanagan's unit 3 months ago to be transferred to ESD. It was very interesting timing. It was very interesting timing. At the same time Nick Flanagan receives information that someone is dobbing him in for misconduct, his close friend and colleague gets transferred to ESD and ends up with the job of investigating his best mate. How very convenient. The Deputy Ombudsman gets the investigation. After this turn of events, I reported it all to the Chief Commissioner. The Deputy Ombudsman, Ian Softman, was given the investigation. Child Care Center, Pedophile Network, Police Pedophiles, and Network X. Ian Softman informed me briefly about a case in the early 1990s. I did my own research into this case and discovered that it involved a crèche in the Mornington Peninsula region. A high-profile group of men were sexually abusing, torturing, and hypnotizing the children. The owner and his wife took the children out of the center during the day to the homes of the rich and powerful, where the children would be sexually abused, tortured, and filmed. And the children were also subjected to satanic ritual abuse. This case was almost identical to those in the U.S. Little Rascals, McMartin, and others. The offenders were wealthy and powerful men in the community and included police officers. Video copies of the children being abused were obtained by Network X. How interesting it is that Network X should be involved. However, when the story went public, the videotapes went missing and the police claimed that they never received them. Ultimately, the police did not take any action against the owner of the crèche, on the grounds that the children were too young to be viewed as credible witnesses. While there was conclusive evidence that the 4 of the children had been raped or sexually abused while at the daycare center, the owner was never charged. A concerned parent with links to the underworld offered the head of a bikie group $10,000 to inflict enough damage so as to ensure that the owner of the creche could never sexually abuse another child again. The head of the bikie group said that they knew about the owner of the creche and what he was up to. However, they could not do the job. Much as they would like to, the owner had protection from the very highest levels. He was untouchable. When the Mornington Peninsula Child Care Center case broke, an investigative journalist infiltrated an elite child pornography and pedophile club based in Melbourne. Its members were all wealthy and elite members of Melbourne society. It was chaired by the CEO of a major Melbourne charitable trust. This article included information on their use of telephone monitoring, courtesy of the group's contacts within telecom. The children from the Mornington Peninsula Child Care Center reported being taken to a pink room with a spa and other significant decor. It was in a house where the children were sexually abused, tortured, and filmed, amongst other locations. 3 children independently identified the house that they had been taken to the investigators. Sure enough, the room had been painted a dusty pink color, and it had a spa and other decor items described by the children. However, as you now know, no further action was taken against the owner of the child care center, nor others suspected of being involved in the ring. What is most significant, however, is that the pink house was registered to the Victoria Police. I am now working with some of the young survivors of the child care center and their families. It is clear that a cover-up of the highest order occurred in 1992, and the children and their families are still suffering from it. Present days. All of this material is currently being investigated by the Deputy Ombudsman. However, the investigation had been marred by suspicious activity. Perhaps the most significant example is the conduct of the police officer Ian Softman appointed to head the investigation, Detective Jock Westland. My colleague, a counselor who worked on the 1992 Mornington Peninsula Creche case, provided Jock Westland with information pertaining to a videotape that depicted police actively involved in the satanic ritual sexual abuse of children from the creche. This is highly significant information. However, I discovered from one of the other investigators that Jock Westland had decided not to pass this information on for further investigation. In fact, his notes read, "This witness, my colleague, has no information of significance." In addition to this, Jock Westland refused to investigate my claims of intimidation and harassment on the grounds that I was paranoid. This is despite the fact that there are many witnesses to certain events who can corroborate my claims, and indeed several provided statutory declarations to do so. Jock Westland has been under investigation for these actions for 2 months now, and I am yet to find out whether he will continue to be involved in this investigation. If he remains on the case, we can be sure that this so-called investigation is just another example of high-level whitewash and cover-up of organized pedophilia and child pornography in Australia. A final note on the Department of Education investigation. I received a letter stating that Dick Newman has been cleared of all charges, as the witnesses could not substantiate my claims. However, of the pool of 8 witnesses I had provided, only one had been contacted, and she clearly reaffirmed the concerns about Dick Newman. Another cover-up of the highest order and complete protection given to one of the untouchable pedophile elites. P.S. All of the real names of these child abusers are kept at several locations with different people. Should anything happen to me or to anyone associated with me, or should I or my organization be harassed in any way, the names will be revealed immediately from several sources.